November 2002. It's been 4 years since you dropped out of high school to pursue your dream of being a competitive Tekken player, and needless to say, it's not going great. Ashamed with your life decisions, your parents had disowned you and kicked you onto the streets. So with nothing more than your bike and a dream, you traveled across the country, attending every Tekken 3 tournament you could. And at first, it went pretty well. You would usually end up placing pretty highly and would often earn extra cash from some juicy side bets. While not even remotely enough to provide a decent living, your earnings were enough to afford McDonald's, which kept you going for years. But then, it happened. In the year 2000, Tekken Tag Tournament was released for PlayStation 2, and nobody cared about Tekken 3 anymore. At first, you thought it was fine. You would have to learn a new game, but you were good at Tekken 3, right? Surely Tekken Tag would just be another game for you to dominate, right? Oh, how wrong you were. Because in Tekken Tag Tournament, you had to play 2 different characters, and the only character you were good with was Kazuya. And so, you proceeded to lose every tournament set of Tekken Tag you entered over the next 2 years, and were only able to survive off the food you scavenged from dumpsters. Eventually though, you gave up your dream of being a competitive Tekken player, vowed to never play it again, and convinced a bank to loan you $300 so you could rent a nearby shack. Which leads us back to now. You're a month behind on rent, and it's only a matter of time before the landlord arrives. You had tried getting a job at several places, but it seems your unwavering eye contact had intimidated all potential employers. Oh no, he's here. Well, you had a lot of fun, but you fear that this might be the end of your adventures. Reluctantly, you made your way to the door. And after gathering all the courage left within your soul, you open the door and head outside. And that's when your eyes lock, and oh, thank God, it's Josh! Josh was your childhood best friend, who you haven't seen since you beat him in the Tekken 3 Waffle House Invitational. He smiled and asked what you had been up to. You told him things hadn't been going so well, but more importantly, wanted to know how he found you. He looked at you sincerely, and said that he always knew where to find his best friend. But enough of that, he said. We haven't seen each other in a long time, and I think I know a good way for us to catch up. Then, he got down on the ground, and unzipped the very large duffel bag he'd brought with him, and pulled out something spectacular. A PlayStation 2, and a copy of Tekken 4. And the vow you had once made to never play Tekken again was forgotten immediately. Releasing in arcades in 2001 before being ported to the PlayStation 2 in March of 2002 for Japan and September for Europe and America, Tekken 4 would attempt to breathe new life into the series by making drastic changes to the tone, atmosphere, and gameplay, and for the first time in Tekken history, a new release was met with severe criticism. Tekken 4 would go on to be the second worst selling mainline Tekken game, only after the original. But was Tekken 4 really that bad? Was it truly the irredeemable garbage that some had claimed, and did it really deserve all the hate it had received? Nope, it was actually pretty sick. 2 years after the events of Tekken 3, Heihachi Mishima has his researchers gather the blood and skin samples of the deceased god of fighting, Ogre, in an attempt to fuse the god's genetic material with his own in order to create the ultimate life form. However, it was quickly discovered that it was impossible to merge the two without another gene present, the Devil Gene, which he lacked. But, as seen at the end of the last Iron Fist tournament, his grandson Jin Kazama had the Devil Gene. Without any clue on his whereabouts though, Jin wasn't an option. Not long after, Heihachi learns that Kazuya's remains had been found and were being kept at a biotech firm known as the G Corporation. Knowing Kazuya's body possessed the Devil Gene, Heihachi sends the Tekken Force to raid the G Corporation in order to take Kazuya's remains. Unfortunately for them, however, it's revealed that Kazuya has been revived by the G Corporation, and he quickly disposes of the Tekken Force and flees the scene. Now having lost both Kazuya and Jin, being the unoriginal man he is, Heihachi decides to hold yet another Iron Fist tournament, knowing it will draw them both out. The twist this time is whoever wins the tournament will inherit the Mishima Zaibatsu in its entirety. And even though Kazuya knows it's a trap, the chance to get his revenge on Heihachi is too good of an opportunity to pass up, and he enters the tournament, along with many new and returning fighters, including Jin Kazama, who had spent the last 2 years unlearning the Mishima fighting style and learning traditional karate. And thus began the King of Iron Fist Tournament 4. Right off the bat, let's start with what hasn't changed. Tekken 4 is still a one-on-one 3D fighting game where your goal is to lower your opponent's health bar before they can lower yours. You still have 4 attack buttons, namely the left and right punch buttons and the left and right kick buttons, which, combined with each other on the D-pad, allows for many character-specific attacks and throws. You still have different ways of getting off the ground when knocked down, such as rolling back, rolling forward, or getting up with an attack. And of course you can still move to the side to avoid attacks, but this leads to our first change. The old sidestep has now been supplemented by a side walk, where you can now continuously move to the side by just holding up or down. This allows you to punish some moves easier than a normal sidestep would allow. Character backdash movement has been heavily reduced. This means that trying to back away from your opponent in order to gain space or to get your opponent to whiff is much more difficult. This is one of the more disliked changes, as it really hampers defensive play, which is a core part of competitive Tekken. Tekken 4 also gave every character a universal grab, which acts as a wall push, which goes along with a very huge addition. Tekken 4 was the first Tekken game to have stages with walls. This means that players now had to be aware of not only where they were in relation to their opponent, but now where in the stage they were, as players hit against the wall could now be hit extra times for additional damage. Stages were also uneven and had dips and slopes in the terrain, and many stages even had obstacles, such as columns in a parking garage, trees in a jungle, and one stage even had phone booths that you could knock your opponents through. And while these are the big changes, there's definitely a bunch more, but for the sake of this section not going on for hours, let's continue on to the different game modes. Unlike the previous games, Arcade Mode is no longer the main single-player mode, as it's been replaced by a proper story mode. To start off, you pick one of the 10 base roster members, including 7 returning characters and 3 new ones. The recently revived Kazuya Mishima, who's now sporting a glowing red eye, Paul Phoenix, who thought he won the last tournament, but left prematurely, leaving Jin to win it all, Xiao Yu, who wants to win so she can build a massive theme park, Yoshimitsu, who insists on looking completely different every game, Martial Law, who has gone bankrupt and has fallen into a deep depression, King, who is out to avenge his mentor Armor King by killing his murderer Marduk, Hwoarang, who's just obsessed with getting to fight Jin again, Christie, who was taught how to fight by Eddie Gordo and serves as his replacement, Marduk, the murderer of Armor King and local bald man, and Steve Fox, the British boxer and biological son of Nina Williams. After choosing a character, you are treated to their prologue, which is presented through a narrator and using some comic book style panels.
Day after day, Jin trained in the traditional art of karate. Ever since his betrayal by Heihachi, Jin loathed anything related to the Mishimas. His lineage, his fighting style, the devil gene in his blood, everything.
These panels just ooze personality, and frankly I don't think any Tekken art we got afterward was nearly this cool. After watching the prologue, we are thrust into the actual gameplay of story mode, which plays out pretty similar to how arcade mode worked in the previous games. You play through 6 to 7 different fights depending on the character, before having to battle Heihachi Mishima, the sponsor of the tournament, on stage 8. He's wearing a diaper, and you know what? Good for him. Finally, after beating him, the game shows a final set of panels discussing the events after your character's victory, followed by an actual cutscene. So functionally, it's just arcade mode from the previous games, but with the additional added story to the beginning and end of each character's run. Which is great, because arcade mode has always been enjoyable, and each character's unique storylines make the extra playthroughs needed to see them all feel worth it. And not every run is exactly the same, as some characters have slightly different routes, like Kazuya, who is meant to fight Jin on the 7th stage, but because Jin is missing, you just skip to the 8th stage and fight Heihachi. Then after you win, Heihachi takes you to Jin, who has been restrained, and after he's freed, you fight him last instead of Heihachi. Small character-specific changes like this separate story mode from your traditional arcade mode. Speaking of arcade mode, it also makes its return. For someone who's not interested in the plot of Tekken 4, you can just play through the classic arcade mode, which is just 7 fights and then a final fight with Heihachi, with no added story or cutscenes, and when you beat him, the game says, "You are the champion!" Which is a very anticlimactic ending, seeing as you just clawed your way through the whole tournament, but I digress. Regardless of which of these 2 modes you play through, every time you complete one of them, you unlock a new character, which includes Jin Kazama, who now has a completely new moveset, much to a lot of people's dismay. Kuma, who's out to defeat Paul after losing to him in the last tournament, Blay, who just got dumped, Nina, who got an assassination contract to kill her son Steve and she took it because she didn't know it was her son because, you know what, never mind. Lee, who now fights under his alter ego Violet, Julia Chang, who's now in a research group being funded by the G Corporation, Brian Fury, who's looking for his creator Dr. Abel, Heihachi, who's like 75 at this point and still kicking, and finally Combat, who is literally just a reskinned Mokujin. Moving on though, most of the other modes available are returning modes from Tekken 3. Time Attack, which is just arcade mode, but you're trying to complete it as fast as possible, Versus Mode, where you can fight against another player, Team Battle, where you face off with large groups of characters, Survival, where you see how many fights you can win without losing a single game, Practice Mode returns, as does each character's move list, then there's also Theater Mode, where you can rewatch each character's ending, watch the opening of the game, and you can also listen to the different songs from the soundtrack. A new mode, however, is the addition of Training Mode, which is not to be confused with Practice Mode. In Training Mode, you are given a series of moves from each character's move list, and you have to complete them as quick as possible. While I personally don't think it's that interesting, I thought it was at least worth noting. Now there is actually one final returning mode, but it's seen such a large overhaul I figured I would give it its own spotlight. Returning from Tekken 3 is Tekken Force, where Tekken becomes a side-scrolling beat-em-up, except in Tekken 4, it's now a 3D beat-em-up. Just like Tekken 3, you battle through 4 different stages, taking on wave after wave of the Tekken Force. The 4 different stages being the military installation, the temple ruins, corridor, and the Mishima Fortress. While very similar in structure, the change in perspective really revamps this version of Tekken Force into feeling like something completely different from the original. As you lock onto different enemies, the camera turns to face them, which while sometimes disorienting, it's much more engaging because since the camera can face any direction, the environments are a lot more fleshed out. And as you defeat enemies, you can pick up the chickens they drop to heal. Each stage actually has predetermined bosses this time around as well. For instance, in the first stage, you will always fight Combat in the end, and in the final stage, you will always go up against Heihachi and his goons. For me though, the best thing about Tekken Force mode this time around is the way they made the Tekken Force themselves much more fun to fight. Throughout the different levels, you'll stumble upon them just casually hanging out, and other times they'll even set up ambushes to catch you off guard. It's obnoxious and hilarious. One last thing to mention is there are a few more unlockables to obtain. After beating story mode with Xiaoyu and Christy, you unlock Xiaoyu's friend Maharu and Eddie Gordo respectively for the both of them. They're pretty much just costumes, but they are nice extra options. You can also choose to play as Lee in his disguise, Violet, and as Panda instead of Kuma. And now let's talk about the most story-relevant ending, Jin's. After breaking out of the chains he'd been placed in by Heihachi during the tournament, Jin manages to defeat him and Kazuya both. Transforming into Devil Jin, he prepares to finish the job before being stopped by a vision of his mother June. And very uncharacteristic of this family, Jin spares them, telling them to thank his mother, and flies off leaving the Mishimas to their quest for power, and undoubtedly to hold another tournament in the near future. And now that we've discussed all that Tekken 4 has to offer, it's time to discuss the general reception. While it certainly has many defenders, Tekken 4 is most commonly agreed to be the most disliked mainline game in the series. Some people even prefer the original Tekken over it. For starters, not even talking about the gameplay, Tekken 4 was going for a much darker tone and trying to be somewhat grounded. No more Aztec gods, no more fire-breathing dragons, just a lot more depression. Obviously, this is a major turnoff to many people, as historically, Tekken has been pretty goofy. I mean, this is the series where the main character threw his dad off a cliff and then looks at the camera and smiles, and one of the longest lasting rivalries is between a dude and a bear, but honestly, I think the change in tone actually helped Tekken 4 stand out from the rest of the series. And many other aspects about the game also have a unique feel to them as well, such as the character designs. I mean, this is the only game where Paul's hair is down, and Jin has his coolest outfit in the whole franchise, and Kazuya dresses like my dad. The game also has one of the all-around best soundtracks in the series, which is saying a lot because Tekken music is pretty much always fire. And let me not fail to mention that the graphical jump from Tag 1 to Tekken 4 was huge, and the jump from 3 to 4 is just ridiculous. Now gameplay-wise is where this game becomes a lot more divisive, mostly on a competitive level. Movement isn't as strong in this game, which tends to be a huge problem for a lot of people, which makes sense. Movement is a key part of player expression, and it being weaker means that your options are more limited, and you can't interact in more nuanced ways. Including the alternate costume characters, Tekken 4 only has 23 playable characters, which is one of the smallest rosters in the series. Also, the balance of this game isn't great. Jin and Steve always being brought up for their strong frames, being generally safe on a lot of things, and stupid stuff like Jin's unblockable laser scraper, and walls in Tekken 4 lead to some absurd damage. But despite all of this, it brings me no shame to say that Tekken 4 is one of my favorites in the entire series. In almost every way it can, Tekken 4 chooses to do something new, and honestly, I think that's its biggest strength. Sure, the game falls apart at the highest level of play, but honestly, that affects a very small portion of the player base. Tekken 4 is sick, and even though future games would undo a lot of the decisions it made, in my opinion, all that did was solidify Tekken 4 as the most unique game in the franchise.